participants are William Fisher, and Mike Reynolds. We join their conversation in the faculty lounge.
Pretty good work in law enforcement. So a friend of mine informed me of a job that was available at the local police department in Mobile that required an FCC license at that particular time to supervise what was essentially the 911 center. They had a centralized dispatch, emergency dispatch center. So I had just come out of the military after serving 4 years in the Air Force, just returned from Alaska, and so I said, well, that sounds like an interesting thing to do, so I applied for the job and they hired me.
Now, were you able to secure the license in the Air Force that did help you get the job when you left the Air Force?
Well, it was helpful, and through self-study I was able to secure the FCC license, which was a radio telephone license. I think they've been, I don't think they even exist anymore, but at that particular time it was sort of a...
Now, was the central dispatching system that you were managing, supervising, was it very big? Did it have many people at that point?
We had probably 8 to 10 on a shift, and of course it was 24-hour, 7-day operation, and we had 8 to 10 personnel, and we responsible for dispatching all the public safety equipment, including police, fire, and public works.
All over the state? So it was
no, it was just the city.
Just the city?
Yeah.
Okay. And then where did you go from there?
Well, just about that time, we had a major federal policy initiative because crime was increasing.
Yes.
And the 1968 Crime Omnibus Bill provided, I think it was probably one of the largest, except the 1994 bill from President Clinton, where there was a great deal of money allocated for law enforcement purposes. But 1968, there was a tremendous amount of money available essentially to help reform policing throughout the United States, to upgrade policing. And one of those components was there was a great deal of money available for education, for higher education. When I went to work for the police department, the criteria certainly did not include any higher education. The criteria usually included physical size, and if you had a high school degree and had a clean record, then you were certainly a great candidate. Yeah, you were a great candidate to go through the police academy. And each department then of any size usually had its own police academy, and that's changed too because training has become standardized. But a number of us took advantage of the law enforcement education program, part of the 1968 Crime Omnibus Bill, and we went to the university off-duty at night, and sometimes we traded shifts to go in the day, and so we went through and obtained our degrees.
So you got a university degree then with the federal assistance that was available.
Yeah, it was a really good program, and the local university at that time recognized, of course, the big need and the focus of the federal government changing policy to provide advanced training, advanced education for police officers, and they developed a program.
Okay. Now, once you got your degree, and the other gentlemen and ladies maybe got their degree, was this kind of a springboard to something else, or are many of the people who were with you still police officers in Mobile, Alabama, or have they gone on to other things as well?
Well, one of my good friends I saw on TV yesterday, who's the chief, Sam Cochran, talking about the recent hurricane that they experienced there. So a number of my friends stayed, and they quickly achieved rank and became senior commanders and senior managers in the police department.
But you took another route.
Yeah. And a number then looked at other opportunities, and some went to federal because the federal agencies were hiring and increasing their personnel. And I really didn't want to leave the area. I kind of liked the area, so I guess that's one reason I was looking for local opportunities, and the state then was hiring parole and probation officers, which required a degree. It was a relatively good job in law enforcement. It was a relatively large increase in salary, and it was daytime. It was Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, with an office in the courthouse, which is a great improvement over shift work and holiday.
Now, Mike, was your experience as a police officer beneficial to you in this role, whereas other people might come in just as a probation parole officer and you know, without the police law enforcement background? How did you feel about that?
There's no question about it, and I think they preferred to hire people with actual police experience because you were dealing with adult offenders, and that group clearly has a lot of worldly experience, and it need to be somewhat streetwise, if you want to use that terminology, or it creates some challenges of dealing with an experienced offender.
Did you experience much recidivism? That is, the people who had been offenders and incarcerated and then were released for parole purposes, that was there a lot of reincarnation, so to speak, incarceration, because they violated parole or they committed other crimes?
Well, actually, it hasn't changed much, and actually, I think the numbers pretty well substantiate even now. And that was, I'm talking about 1976, 1977 period. About 70 to 80% of chronic offenders reoffend.
No kidding.
And so the revolving door situation hasn't changed much. We haven't really developed the ability to effectively, efficiently rehabilitate chronic offenders.
Now, don't let me get too personal here, but let me ask: with that kind of a repeat offender record, does that get discouraging to parole officers, probation officers? I mean, were you ever really discouraged because, you know, 60 to 70, maybe 75% of the people who you were dealing with wound up back in prison? Or to me, the reason I'm asking is that to me that would be, you know, students who keep failing, and I would say, am I really doing something beneficial here?
Well, actually, and you hit on a very key point. And not only was that very discouraging, however, and I think in many cases it's not changed. Although I've done some research here in Florida and dealt with parole and probation, so it is a little bit different in Florida. But at that time, we had probably 120, 130 individuals in our caseload, which makes it impossible to really do an effective supervision or intervention into any behavior or anything.
How frequently did someone on probation on parole have to come to visit you to report what he or she was doing?
Minimum requirements was once a month. They were required to report in person once a month. And depending on their situation, you could change those requirements. In other words, if you got some information or you learned somehow that this individual was somehow into a high-risk situation, then you could impose different requirements, conditions. And you actually were working for two different entities because parole was all state, so the state parole board had jurisdiction over those offenders, but the local courts had jurisdiction over the probationers. So our office was situated in the courthouse amongst the various courts. There were 9 courts in my particular jurisdiction, so you actually worked for 9 different judges plus the parole board.
Yes, interesting. And then you went on to do some other things after that.
Well, a friend of mine was elected to what we would know in Florida as the state's attorney for the county, which was the 2nd largest county in the state, and then he decided to run for state attorney general. And he did. As a matter of fact, he was the first constitutional officer elected in Alabama from South Alabama, because it was predominantly controlled by northern interests, and northern interstate being coal interests that control politics. So it was quite an accomplishment to get a constitutional officer elected from the south part of the state. So he and a close group of my friends and some ex-police officers that I work with who now work for him went to Montgomery.
The state capital.
The state capital to assume the various duties and responsibilities of the Attorney General. And I didn't want to move. And it's interesting that we just had a back-to-back hurricanes, and of course it's affected us in a lot of different ways. At that time, we had a major hurricane hit Mobile. And the place I was living was on the bay, was actually destroyed. So I had to relocate. So.
And you were safe, no injuries to you?
Safe, no injuries. And so my friends in Montgomery said, okay, you have to relocate, so now move to Montgomery and work with us. And so I transferred. I worked for a state agency, so it was a transfer from one state agency to the other. So I ended up in Montgomery, and in Montgomery I was assigned to work corrupt public officials and white-collar crime. And it was very interesting. We worked some very interesting cases. I was involved in some serial murder cases that were high publicity cases. I was involved in some constitutional officer cases where we actually convicted a state constitutional officer for fraudulent activities. The problem there was just a few of us, and we covered the entire state, so it ended up that we traveled extensively and we were not home much. So after a while, that sort of became a detractor for otherwise what was an incredibly interesting job.
Certainly understandable. But at some point now, you must have rekindled an interest in academia, or felt that you wanted to contribute through the educational system, you know, with kind of criminal justice as the focus, but leave an actual law enforcement agency to come into the academic world.
Well, in the Attorney General's office was a very interesting environment, because in the Attorney General's office it was a large, very large office. We had about 400 people, and of course the State Attorney General, and most people are probably not aware what they do, but you know, they're responsible for all the legal activities within the state, which means criminal and civil. And actually the criminal side is their smaller side of what they do. And but I was very fortunate on the criminal side to work with some incredibly bright people, some extremely bright, highly motivated, younger attorneys. And as a matter of fact, one of them became one of the renowned national experts in death penalty cases, and he's recently appointed us as a federal judge. But I think that group, and working with that group, really motivated me to increase my educational skills and knowledge. So I went back to get a master's degree.
Back to school.
Felt, you know, I felt motivated to.
In Montgomery?
Yes, and so I felt motivated to go back to school and learn more about research-based, and because also I think what really impacted me is we were involved in many cases, and I would actually help them do legal research, prepare briefs or whatever when we would prepare court cases, because we did go to court quite a bit in various cases. So I guess that rekindled my academic interest and research interest, because I guess then I started understanding that I really like research to try to get more information about issues and problems and understand more phenomena. But also in investigative work, for instance, which is very interesting, it takes a natural curiosity to, I think, be a successful investigator, because especially in white-collar crime or corrupt public officials, they're very difficult cases which require
a lot of digging.
A lot of digging, and it's not just like going down to the court records or interviewing some people like we see on TV. You know, these individuals normally have business affairs or some type of activities in multiple states, in multiple corporations. It does require a high level of curiosity and willingness to get into the research.
And a vigilance, I'm sure, that tenaciousness.
Right.
Now, let me ask a sensitive question, maybe, because I feel this in my own field, too, of hospitality. Because when you were getting your master's and you were a mature student, if I could put it that way, did you find that you knew a lot of the material already, or did you find that you knew more than your professors, perhaps, or at least as much as your professors? Or, you know, what was your sense of things coming into getting a master's at an older age than maybe many of your peers?
I don't think I ever felt like that I knew more than the professors. I think that I did clearly understand that through the real world experience, that I had more insight or broader insight into the subject domain, whatever it might be. I don't think I ever really took the position that I was wasting my time or that I knew more than they did. I think I always had a respect for their position, and I just attempted to learn as much as I could from them.
Now, with the intensity and the passion that you felt as the result of the work with the state's attorneys generals and so on, did you really get bit by the bug to go ahead with for a PhD? Did you get, how did all that come about?
Well, it's kind of interesting, and my friend, the Attorney General, we did an exceptionally good job the first 4 years, and of course the constitutional offices in Alabama, like many states, were term limited. You could only serve 2 terms.
Yes.
We ran unopposed to the second term, which was pretty significant. Our support was so strong that we didn't even feel a contender. And then we ran for governor, and an incredibly complex political story with the outcome that we actually won in the primary. We were contested by the opposite party, and through some very interesting political machinations, we were thrown off the ballot, and the loser was put on the ballot, who eventually lost in the general election because of all the political problems that were going on. So, to make a long story short, after spending a year involved in 7 days a week, 24 hours a day almost, in a gubernatorial campaign that we won but lost, I was pretty tired of state government. I was pretty tired of politics, and sort of reevaluated and said, well, gosh, what do you really want to do? And that nagging, I guess, curiosity and desire to have more knowledge and to do research was pretty strong. So I said, well, you know, this is kind of a fork in the road. You can go back into government service. I certainly had the ability to do that. Or you can do something that might be more interesting, might be more challenging, might be more rewarding. So I sort of jumped and said, you know, I think I'm going to try this.
Almost a defining moment in your life.
Right, I did. And I sort of took a leap of faith, and a lot of my friends said, you're too old for this, this is crazy, you need to go back. You know, there's plenty of...
How long did it take you to get your PhD?
Well, I went through it in 4 years, really. And I worked really hard, and I was very fortunate because I inadvertently secured a large federal grant. I didn't know they were difficult to get, and nobody told me they were difficult to get. So I saw an area that was very interesting to me, and I applied for a grant in conjunction with my major professor, and we got it. Early on, as a matter of fact, during my beginning of the PhD process.
Was that the basis for your doctoral thesis?
It was. So, as you well know, then what that did was provided me a great advantage of completing the program sooner, because early on I was actually working on my dissertation.
So now you got the PhD, and now what do you decide to do? Where'd you go?
Well, I was in New Orleans for some time, and developed a really interesting partnership with some individuals at the New Orleans Police Department. And this was at a period not so long ago when the New Orleans Police Department was beleaguered. Its reputation wasn't one of the best in the United States.
Yes, I remember a 60 Minutes program that said that it was not one of the best.
Correct.
And I think, with all due respect to that wonderful city, which has wonderful restaurants, by the way, and hotels, I think it, for a little while, had the reputation of being kind of the murder capital of the United States.
It was. It was. New Orleans had lots of problems. And the police department had become really disorganized. It had become managed by patronage positions. The professional level of the police department had plummeted. The morale had plummeted. They were authorized to have 1,500 officers. They had 1,000 officers. Crime was rampant, and it was really a serious situation. And it was affecting the economic base of New Orleans, and that impact on the economic base finally precipitated the business community to sort of rise up and say, enough's enough.
We got to fix it.
And the police department's got to be fixed.
Yeah.
Well, during that period, I developed some relationships and partnerships with numerous law enforcement practitioners and a number in the police department, because they were coming to the university, some of them were coming to the university seeking help, and they knew they needed help in various areas, and myself and some others were trying to help them as best we could, and they didn't have a lot of money, so we devoted a lot of time, public service, to try to help, which was very gratifying. But then a really good friend of mine who got his Ph.D. at the University of New Orleans and now is the chief of police of Nashville Police Department, was appointed, in the New Orleans police reform that they implemented in, I think, 1995, 1996. He was appointed chief of operations, the #2 person in the police department. So I was very fortunate then to be able to work at a high level at the police department to help them with some technology issues and some major reform issues, and to see the results of a major sweeping police reform. They brought in a new chief of police who was very good, from Washington, D.C. And he was very good, very honest, straight arrow, exactly what they needed. And my friend Ronnie was very skilled with police operations and management, and they foisted an entire new model literally overnight on the New Orleans Police Department and totally reformed it. Amazing story. And changed the crime situation very rapidly. Major crimes plummeted 30–40%, and it was very effective.
Now here you are with a Ph.D., and were you on the faculty at the university at that point, or were you freelance consulting, or how were you? You were helping the New Orleans Police Department in your position with the university. Is that right?
Well, actually, I was, because of securing the external funding, and as a matter of fact, I've got another federal grant, to my great surprise, after the first one, because of the ability to secure the federal funding, then they created a position for me as a research associate. So I was actually, I was not a faculty member, but I was actually on staff
you were on
as
the
a
line
researcher.
and a budget.
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct. I was a staff. Had a staff position in the college, and myself and a few others were working extensively with the local law enforcement agencies.
Well, if I can do a compare and contrast here a little bit, Mike, and hearkening back to our few moments ago when we talked about possibly being discouraged, not you personally, but with the probation parole issue, where there is a lot of recidivism there, and that has to, cause one to wonder if one is really making a major contribution. Now to the point where there was a corrupt police department in New Orleans, and you were with the university, and you did have the government grant, you do have a Ph.D. at this point, that you must have been elated. You must have been really walking on air with what you were able to do in terms of support and assistance to them.
Well, it hasn't changed, and that's a good point. And I think one area perhaps that academicians, and you and I talked somewhat a bit about this earlier, the two-track probably academic, the one that moves into the field of academia after having some practical experience, versus the individual that probably doesn't have any real practical experience in the field, who's gone straight through the educational system, and at 25, 26, 27 enters academia and doesn't have the advantage maybe or experience that a practitioner may have. The individual who has the practical experience, I think, has the ability to negotiate the difference between the two worlds, because there is essentially, I think you might agree with this, I don't know, there is really two worlds. There's the world of academia that can be often removed somewhat.
Sometimes called the ivory tower.
Right, that's correct. That somewhat can be removed from the practical,
The real world.
everyday, you know, activities that go on in the real world.
Right.
And I think there are valid reasons for that, and and I see a lot of benefits to that as well, plus some negatives sometimes. But and I work extensively now with many local police agencies, statewide, as a matter of fact.
I was going to ask you, what brought you to Orlando now from New Orleans, and can you tell me a little bit about, you know, your work now, the research that you're doing, and I know that there's been tremendous advancement in terms of communication between and among the various agencies.
Well, before I leave the last point, though, you were talking about being discouraged when you're seeing high recidivism rate.
Yes.
Well, what happened was I found myself in a position now in New Orleans by being at the university to work interactively with the practitioners, because they were very discouraged. I mean, you couldn't find a group of people more discouraged than individuals in the New Orleans Police Department who wanted to be a part of a very an outstanding organization and contribute to the community and, you know, be good at what they do. Because what you'll find out, and I'm sure you see this in your area as well, there's some dedicated professionals that take a great deal of pride and satisfaction in what they do.
Absolutely.
And they don't, and they want to do it well. So when you're able to help them, when you're able to really help them achieve those goals and objectives, to me, that's when the gratification really
very
comes.
Very rewarding, sure.
And because of the ability of the experience to understand both worlds, then what happens is I found out that you have an increased ability to help leverage resources that are available, which are substantial in the academic setting, in the university setting, over to the applied side.